Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Putnam, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director here at the Concord Museum. And on behalf of the staff and the Board of Governors, I welcome you to our annual Sally Lanagan Lecture. I'm pleased to be broadcasting this evening from the balcony of Brook Hall, where we just recently installed this bronze working model of the sculpture of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial, sculpted by one of Concord's favorite sons, Daniel Chester French. I hope many of you watching at home will come soon to visit when the air has cleared to see it. Let me pause here to pay tribute to the late Sally Lanagan, who was a valued member of the Concord Museum community for over 20 years. Her enthusiasm for and devotion to the museum was surpassed only by her generosity and warmth of spirit. Sally served as the president of the Guild of Volunteers, a member of our Board of Governors, and a key leader in the museum's garden tour and family tree display. Members of Sally's family are joining us this evening, including her husband, Mike, sons, Sean and Tad, and their respective families. And I want to publicly thank all of the Lanagans for their continued support of not only this lecture, but our wide series of public forums and family programs. I first met this evening's speaker, H.W. Brands, in 2013 at a conference at Northumbria University in Newcastle, England, sponsored by the Presidential History Network, which is the professional association of European, primarily British scholars who study the American presidency. Professor Brands was the keynote speaker and mesmerized us all with his thoroughly engaging talk about how early in his career he undertook to weave together a narrative history of the United States by writing a series of biographies about our nation's presidents and founders. But what struck me more over the course of that multi-day conference was not the public performer and the prolific author, and the fact that he is an exemplar in both of those roles, but the other intangible that makes an outstanding teacher, a deep and sincere interest and care in one's students and emerging scholarship. Due to my previous work at a presidential library, I've attended scores of academic conferences where the keynote speaker flies in, delivers a great speech, perhaps attends the celebratory dinner, and is then gone. But few where, as Professor Brands did, the world-renowned and best-selling historian not only attended every session, but gave positive and constructive feedback to the younger scholars as they presented the findings from their research. I counted the titles of books authored by Professor Brands today, 35, and 4 more that he has edited, numbers that are as manifold as the mugs of beer we were respectively offered in England. Our colleagues in Newcastle truly appreciate their brown ale. And please note I specified the number of drafts Bill and I were offered without any reference to how many we each consumed. I, for one, wasn't counting. I can't speak highly enough about Professor Brand's new book, The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for American Freedom, which historian Harold Holzer, one of the nation's preeminent Lincoln experts, who has spoken here at the museum twice in the last 2 years, describes as featuring the riveting narrative sweep, sharp eye for detail, and original analysis we've come to expect from H.W. Brands. I smiled when I got to page 129 of the book, when residents of Concord make an appearance, including Frank Sanborn and Henry David Thoreau. Let me read just one line. John Brown arrived in Boston in early 1857. He hoped to raise money for his continuing campaign, and to the armchair abolitionists of New England, he was a great hero, the only authentic freedom fighter most of them had ever encountered. Now, I know one of the benefits of virtual forums is to be able to watch these programs from the comfort of your homes, making us, I suppose, heirs to our forebears as armchair historians from New England, still enraptured by the likes of Lincoln and Brown and the debate during their and our time over how best to move our country closer to our founding ideals. The biography is available at the Concord Bookshop, and if your sweetheart enjoys reading engaging histories, I might suggest you give it to him or her the day after Valentine's Day, which this year happens to be, appropriately enough, President's Day, lest you lose their amorous attentions once they begin reading this page-turner of a biography. Let me conclude with 2 observations from Henry David Thoreau. First, I'll note that Professor Brands is the Jack Blanton Chair in History at the University of Texas at Austin, where he also earned his doctorate. Anticipating an issue we face today with the internet and social media, Thoreau once wrote, quote, "We are in great haste to construct a magnetic telegraph from Maine to Texas. But Maine and Texas, it may be, have nothing important to communicate with each other. And more appropriate and more apropos to tonight's lecture, Thoreau wrote in October of 1859, just days after John Brown's unsuccessful raid at Harper's Ferry, where Brown was captured and jailed by local authorities, which you'll hear more about in a moment. Thoreau wrote, quote, "There was a remarkable sunset this evening, but it was hard for me to see its beauty then, when my mind was filled with Captain Brown. So great a wrong as his fate implied overshadowed all the beauty of the world." So great an honor it is for me to welcome Bill Brands to the Concord Museum's virtual stage to share this remarkable page from our national history, demonstrating that, at least for this evening, Texas has much to communicate with us, and Bill, we're all ears. Take it away.
Thank you, Tom, for that very kind introduction. I am honored and delighted to be speaking with the supporters of the Concord Museum and to be able to talk about this project that I've been working on for the last several years. But like very many of the books that I end up writing, it has its genesis years earlier. I'm a teacher of American history, and I have been teaching American history since the late 1970s. So I've had a chance to think about a lot of the topics that I end up writing books about. So I knew the story of John Brown. I have known the story of Abraham Lincoln. I, of course, encountered them in high school, I suppose, the first time. But I had to start figuring out how to explain them to students. I have initially taught high school students, and then community college students, and then college and university students. And so since, well, for the last 40 years, I have been dealing with John Brown and Abraham Lincoln and the issues that confronted them. The longer I teach, the more I conclude that the essential questions of history, the lasting questions of history, are not really questions of historical fact or even historical interpretation. They are at their heart questions of human nature. Why are humans the way they are? And I find myself posing questions of particular individuals in the past or particular periods in the past. And I want to see sort of how they responded to those questions. So the question that motivates my book on John Brown and Abraham Lincoln is one that certainly every generation of citizens of a democracy, in our case, the American democracy, or actually just people encounter in life. And the question is this: what does the good person do in the face of evil? So what do you do when you know that a group you're in, a person you're with, a country that you're part of is going wrong? What do you do? It's a question, I'd suggest, that does come up, certainly in every generation. I was born in 1953, so I'm a little bit too young to have sort of had to make a decision like that regarding the civil rights marches and protests and demonstration of the 1960s. So I was 12 years old when the Voting Rights Act was passed. So this was something, when you're 12 years old, what do you know? I was a little bit too young for that, but I wasn't too young to have to formulate an opinion on the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War came home to me, as it did to many people in college, in the form of, well, if this war is still going on when I get out of college, I might be off to the war. Or actually, so I came along, I was in college from 1971 to 1975. And in the middle of that, actually, I guess in 1972, the Nixon administration decided to end the student deferments. And so I was going to be drafted. And this tends to focus one's mind. This, by the way, is, if you ask me, the primary reason that there have been almost no campus protests against the long-running wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, because almost none of the students have anything really at stake there, the way people did in the 1960s and 1970s. So by the time I was in college, I had concluded that the Vietnam War was wrong. And I couldn't exactly have spelled out in what way it was right. I thought it was bad policy. I thought it was immoral. I just thought it was wrong. And in fact, I took part in demonstrations against the war. I marched against the war, and I became a conscientious objector. against the war. So that was my answer to the question of what do you do as a citizen when you think your government is doing wrong? So this was the question that I had to deal with myself. This is a question that I posed to my students. And I mean, I apply to history, but of course they're allowed to extrapolate to the present. Is there something they think is going on? And this can be as relatively minor as if you're on a playground and you're 11 years old and somebody's acting like a bully to somebody else, what do you do? Do you ignore it? Do you stand up? Do you call out? Do you tell the teacher? What do you do? To me, this is almost at the heart of the responsibility of any citizen. And so this is the question I pose to John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, sort of on behalf of my readers, but also sort of on behalf of myself. I choose the subjects I choose because they interest me. And I like to think if I tell a good story and I get to the heart of the issue, that maybe it will interest readers. Now, when I started the book on John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, when I really sort of made it my principal project, I had no idea that there would be the very widespread protests against police brutality and racial and other kinds of inequality that have occurred in the last year. So in that regard, it turned out to be the book, or the consideration of this question in the context of the 19th century, turned out to be more timely than I thought, but I guess it sort of reinforced the way I think of this question is it's a timeless question. So if the question is timeless, then it's, I guess, always timely in one form or another. So the question is this. The question, in fact, directly for John Brown and Abraham Lincoln is, what do you do about slavery? For the purposes of my research and my narrative and analysis, it was crucial that the two men agreed that slavery was evil, because my question isn't what makes a policy evil or what makes a policy wrong. No, what do you do once you've concluded that it's evil? And this is, I think, the key thing. It's easy to conclude that something is wrong. I mean, people say they're dissatisfied with government all the time. So, well, what are you going to do about it? The question for the citizen is, what are you going to do about it? And so I guess it goes without saying that if everybody agrees in a democracy that a policy is wrong, then the policy just goes away, because if everybody gets to vote against it, the policy goes away. So John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, they're near contemporaries. John Brown was born in 1800, Abraham Lincoln in 1809. So they're almost a decade apart, but they're close enough that they're in the prime of their adult lives, the prime of their public lives at the same time. And they come to the conclusion that slavery was wrong, that slavery was, they both would have said it was evil, although Brown would have stressed that evil more than, and Lincoln sort of more the wrong policy kind of thing. But they both thought it was, well, I won't say, John Brown definitely thought it was immoral. Lincoln, yeah, I suppose, but not with such vehemence as Brown. But in developing my story, I have to point out that they didn't initially think it was quite as wrong as they came to think it was. And in this regard, they were no different than most of the people of their generation. And this is where when I'm thinking about this in the context of teaching my students, and almost anybody else today, because it's really difficult to get people today who haven't thought about it or read history much to believe that there was a time when a lot of people did not believe that slavery was wrong, that slavery was just sort of part of the world. Slavery was like war and death and taxes and disease. It's an unfortunate aspect of life. But slavery had been around from before anybody could remember. And so we can't eliminate all the evils in life. So why is this any worse than any other? So part of my story is to develop the evolution of thinking in the United States on slavery. And here I can say it's worth a reminder that in 1776, at the time of American independence, slavery was perfectly legal in every state of the Union. And it's also fair to say that there was a general agreement that slavery was kind of wrong, but necessary. It fell in the category of necessary evils in life. And to underscore this with my students and audiences, sometimes I pose a question the following way. And so I'll pose the question to all of you. So how many of you think that war is a good thing? You know, other things being equal, you'd like to see more war. So if we were in a lecture hall, I'm going to guess that none of you would raise your hand. So basically, we're all agreed that slavery is not a good thing. So for the purposes of our discussion, we'll say slavery is an evil. War is war. You think that war is not a good thing. So war is an evil. My next question to all of you is, how many of you are thoroughgoing pacifists who believe that under no circumstances is force a legitimate response to anything, even use of force against you? And if this audience is anything like most audiences, including my students, maybe out of a group of 200, 300, maybe 1 or 2 people would raise their hand. So I say then, well, I'll conclude from this that you think that war might sometimes be an appropriate response. So you're willing to go along with war. You don't like it, you think that it's wrong, but sometimes it's necessary. So war is a necessary evil. And I think this basically describes the attitude of most people toward war. And I'd say extrapolate that back to 1776 and swap out slavery for war, okay? And that was really the attitude of most people. There was a hope that slavery would go away. Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder, hoped and actually believed that slavery would outlive its usefulness in this American republic. Some of it would be as a result of the evolution of economy. Some of it would be greater enlightenment among people. But he believed that, and for his whole life until he died in 1826, he continued to hope that slavery would end and that the United States could live up to its ideals, including the ideal that he articulated in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal with a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the feeling was in 1776, and it was true pretty much north to south, but that opinion changed over time. It changed maybe most obviously first in the North, where Northerners concluded that slavery was no longer so necessary as it had been. And one by one, the Northern states, sometimes by judicial verdict, mostly by changes in laws, ended slavery. So that by the beginning of the 19th century, slavery was a Southern thing. It was no longer Northern. Now, when I say this, I have to point out that many of the Northern states phased out slavery. So there were slaves legally resident and living in New York until well into the 19th century because they'd sort of been grandfathered in. Anyway, as and I should point out that the abolition of slavery in the North was not primarily due to the fact that residents of the northern states all of a sudden became more moral than they had been before. It had more to do with the fact that slavery came to seem less necessary to the economies of the North. And what would become sort of the market revolution, then the industrial revolution, the modernizing changes in the economy hit the northern states before they hit the southern states. And one of the things that a modern economy needs is a flexible workforce. And slavery is many things, but it's definitely not a form of flexible labor. With slavery, you're sort of stuck with your workers. You have to support the workers when they're young, when they're old, when they're working, when they're not. With a flexible workforce, the kind that the northern economies developed, you can hire the workers for the time you need them, then you lay them off. They're not your responsibility. If they get injured, they're not your responsibility. If they get old, they're not your responsibility. If they're children, they're not your responsibility. But anyway, so slavery disappeared from the North. Slavery actually, and this was a surprising thing to Jefferson and other people, slavery became more entrenched in the South, primarily because of changes in the Southern economy, principally in the cultivation of cotton. Anyway, that's a background, because it's only by about 1820 that you see this serious divergence in moral attitudes towards slavery. There had been people in the North, Quakers and a few Methodists, who had been morally opposed to slavery from the middle of the 18th century. But the broader view that slavery is wrong and therefore we can act against it, that didn't really kick in until the early part of the 19th century. And by the 1830s, there was a serious division of views on what slavery represented and what ought to be done about it. So that's the general background. Let's look first at John Brown, and then we'll come to Abraham Lincoln. John Brown was born in Connecticut. His family moved when he was quite young to Ohio, and he grew up in Ohio. And John, in Ohio, being right next door, right across the Ohio River from Kentucky, a slave state, Ohio was a free state, John Brown was used to seeing Black people working in the fields and driving teams of horses and doing this and that. And it's worth remembering that even in the free North, slaves could often be seen when Southerners traveled to the North. If they wanted to bring along their personal servants, they could, and nobody would bother them. If somebody owned property in Kentucky and Ohio and had gangs of workers, the workers could go work in Ohio for a while, as long as they didn't stay too long. So John Brown was familiar with Black laborers. And as a kid, he sort of didn't think one thing or the other about them. He saw white people working in the field. He saw Black people working in the field. But he remembered later that there was a moment when he was maybe 9 or 10 years old. He was a 9 or 10-year-old kid. He was playing with this other 9 or 10-year-old kid about the same age who happened to be Black. And John Brown didn't really think much about it until they'd been playing for a while. And all of a sudden, this man, a white man, came up to this Black boy and started yelling at him, and then started hitting him about the head and shoulders. And John Brown recalled thinking, wait a minute, what is this? And then he realized, this young man, this boy is a slave. And because he's a slave, this other guy can do something to him that he can't do to me. And John Brown remembered this. And he remembered that, okay, so there really is this difference between me and this Black slave. And it stuck in his head. And so he recalled this was the first time he thought that slavery was wrong in some ways. But when you're a kid, what do you know? What do you do about something that is wrong? John Brown began searching for something to do about slavery, but he couldn't figure out what it was for years. Now, it's important to the John Brown story that John Brown wasn't very good about figuring out most things in life. If John Brown had been successful materially at any of the number of things that he had done, he probably would not have taken the career path he did, possibly, but less likely. John Brown was not a success as a farmer. He was not a success as a herder of cattle and sheep. He was not a success in the business ventures that he tried. He just couldn't seem to get a grip on life. The one thing that he was really good at was having children. He had 20 children by 2 wives, and they needed to be supported, which was why he was always trying one thing and another, but he just couldn't stick to it. His heart wasn't in it. He was opposed to slavery, but it was hardly the preoccupation of his life. He had other things to think about until one day in 1837. He was living in Hudson, Ohio, near Akron, with his family, and he got news that Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist editor, had been murdered by a pro-slavery mob in Illinois. And John Brown believed that this was a message to him, or at least that he could take a message from it. It was his epiphany. And he stood up in his church in Hudson, Ohio, and he said, here, before the eyes of God, before my fellow congregationists, I pledge to devote my life, the rest of my life, to the battle against slavery. John Brown had found his calling. He concluded that he was an abolitionist. Now, here it's important to distinguish abolitionists from other people who were simply opposed to slavery. Because we're going to get to Abraham Lincoln in a moment, and Abraham Lincoln was opposed to slavery, but he was not an abolitionist. The abolitionists were men like William Lloyd Garrison, who believed that slavery was the preeminent issue facing the American Republic. And it was the thing that had to be dealt with before anything else. Now, abolitionists like Garrison, like John Brown, believed, for example, that ending slavery took precedence over preserving the Constitution, preserving the Union. Garrison went so far as to burn a copy of the Constitution and to advocate Northern secession from the South. Now, this is an interesting concept because if you think about it for a moment, if the North seceded from the South, that by itself would free no slaves at all. All it would do is basically free the consciences of Northern abolitionists from any responsibility for the slaves, because now they would be in a different country. But anyway, so the abolitionists thought that opposition to slavery, ending slavery, took precedence over everything else. And John Brown essentially joined those ranks on that day in 1837. But it still took him a while to figure out what that meant. He began to assist in the operations of the Underground Railroad, the system, the network of safe houses and roads that would get escaped slaves, the fugitives from slavery in places like Kentucky, to Canada. If you just got to a free state, that wasn't good enough because the Constitution required the assistance in the return of stolen property, and fugitive slaves were classified as stolen property. They had stolen themselves away. And this is what Brown did for a while. He moved his family to upstate New York to an abolitionist colony called North Elba, where Black people and white people worked side by side. The whole idea was to demonstrate that Black people, if given the opportunity, could be just as successful, just as productive as white people. And John Brown decided this would be a good thing to get involved in. But what really triggered the attention of John Brown was the changing politics of the slavery question starting in about 1850. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, the new Fugitive Slave Act, as part of the Compromise of 1850. And the Fugitive Slave Act required northern judges, sheriffs, and northern individuals to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. If they didn't, they could be thrown in prison. The Fugitive Slave Act overruled the personal liberty laws that had been passed by nearly every northern state that said, these are sort of the equivalent then of the sanctuary city and sanctuary state laws that have been passed in recent years regarding immigration and forbidding local authorities from assisting with immigration officials. So it made Northerners like John Brown complicit in the capture and return of fugitive slaves. But what really drew the attention of John Brown and other people was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which undid the Missouri Compromise, the part of the Missouri Compromise that said that the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase would be forever off limits to slavery. That had been part of the deal. This had been settled law for over 30 years. And Congress, under the inspiration of the goad of Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who wanted to become president and needed to find something that could unite Northern and Southern Democrats, pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which said that Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory would be open potentially to slavery on the principle of popular sovereignty. What this meant was that settlers could go to Kansas Territory from the north and take their cows and horses and settle there. And settlers could go to Kansas Territory from the south and take their horses and their cows and their slaves and settle there. And then when there were enough people in Kansas to warrant statehood for Kansas, they would write a constitution. And if there were more people in Kansas who opposed slavery, then the Kansas Constitution would say no slavery, and Kansas would enter the Union as a free state. But if there were more people from the South, more people who supported slavery, then Kansas would enter the Union as a slave state. The way Douglas phrased it, the way he put it, is what could be more democratic than that? Let people decide. But what this formula actually turned out to be was an invitation to Northerners and Southerners who felt strongly about the issue of slavery to go to Kansas basically to fight it out. And that's precisely what John Brown did. He went with several of his adult sons, and off to Kansas they went to wage war on behalf of freedom, to wage war against slavery, more precisely, to wage war against the pro-slavery settlers that were coming to Kansas Territory from the South. Violence developed, and the destruction of property and the destruction of life. And in one moment that fans of John Brown ever since have had a hard time explaining away, John Brown led a band of 5 of his followers in the dead of night to a hamlet on Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas Territory. And John Brown and his men dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their beds and brutally murdered them, hacked them to death with broadswords. Now, in today's terminology, this would be a clear case of terrorism. These men were not threatening the lives of John Brown and his men. This was an act undertaken for political purposes, violence for political purposes. John Brown wanted to send the message to other potential settlers of Kansas from the South: if you come to Kansas, this could happen to you. So John Brown, all of a sudden, is this notorious figure. He's wanted for murder in Kansas, and he goes around the country under assumed names in disguise. He grows out his beard, he cuts his beard, grows out his hair, cuts his hair, calls himself several other things. Even as he is circulating among abolitionist circles in places in the North, in New York, in the vicinity of Boston, where he meets Frank Sanborn and Henry David Thoreau and various others of the abolitionists in New England. And he is asking for money. And he's a very compelling character, made more compelling by the fact that there are stories that he has committed this lethal violence against pro-slavery settlers in Kansas. And John Brown was canny enough. John Brown was canny enough not to admit anything, but neither did he deny anything. And people like Thoreau and Sanborn and various other people that he talked to, they were, I guess, cautious enough not to ask him directly, did you do what they say you did? There was, well, I guess basically, when you put it in self-interested terms, they didn't want to be accessories after the fact or anything like that. But more the point, they were really thrilled by the fact that here was a guy who had the courage of their convictions. They had been talking against slavery and writing against slavery and congratulating themselves, one and the other, against how strongly they were promoting the abolitionist gospel. But they weren't doing anything about it. But John Brown was doing something about it. And John Brown was a magnetic individual. He could certainly persuade people who were far more educated than he was, but he could also persuade people to risk their lives for him. Although, as we'll see, there was one key figure that he couldn't quite persuade, and I'm about to get there, because what John Brown was raising money for was, so John Brown went around New England, went around Rochester, New York, and various other places in the North, raising money. For what? For what? To carry on the fight in Kansas. He let his contributors think. But no, he was in fact going to take the war, as he put it, to Africa, to the South. He was going to wage war against slavery in the South. He was already planning his raid on Harper's Ferry. And so the Harper's Ferry raid was a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which was the home of a federal arsenal. The plan was to capture a bunch of weapons and distribute them among enslaved people, enslaved young men, presumably of military age, in the vicinity, and they would rise up in insurrection, in armed insurrection against their masters, and they would achieve their freedom. This was Brown's plan. And he didn't want to tell anybody he didn't want to tell the people who were giving him money that this was what he's going to use it for, but he did. This is what the money was used for. And just before the raid on Harper's Ferry, John Brown tried to persuade Frederick Douglass to go along. Frederick Douglass, the acclaimed former slave abolitionist, well-known in the United States, well-known in England, and one of the most articulate, striking individuals in the abolitionist movement. And John Brown reasoned that if Frederick Douglass came along, then all of a sudden his effort on behalf of abolition, on behalf of freeing the slaves, would have legitimacy that it didn't have otherwise. And John Brown talked and tried to convince Frederick Douglass, and Douglass said no. And Douglass's reasoning to John Brown was, well, basically it was, I'm a writer, not a fighter. Hey, I escaped slavery once. I don't want to have to deal with that again. But at a deeper level, and he didn't exactly tell this to John Brown to his face, but he knew that John Brown's mission to Harper's Ferry was a suicide mission, that it was going to fail. And the reason he knew this was that it was by no means automatic that the enslaved men to whom John Brown handed the weapons would take the weapons, because as much as they wanted freedom, they didn't want to risk their lives. They didn't want to lose their lives in a misbegotten crusade cooked up by this crazy John Brown. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. John Brown was able to, and his men were able to seize the arsenal of Harper's Ferry, but they couldn't hold it for long, and they couldn't get any of the slaves in the area to take them up on the offer, in part because those slaves knew what Frederick Douglass knew. First of all, that for any slave in almost anywhere in the South, you put a weapon in your hand and you've committed a capital offense. And so you're going to be shot by the first person who sees you. And secondly, this whole thing depended on the strategy that John Brown had laid out, which turned out to be as misguided as could be. It was easy to get into Harper's Ferry, but it's really hard to get out of Harper's Ferry. And if you've ever been to Harper's Ferry, it's sort of the bottom of these canyons where a couple of rivers come together. And all it takes is a very small group, in this case, National Guard, to pin John Brown down. Anyway, so John Brown was captured. He was put on trial. He was convicted and he was executed. And in the process, he became a secular saint among the abolitionists of the North, because John Brown had given his life for the cause that other people like Sanborn and Amos Lawrence and other people had simply given their dollars. And so it elevated John Brown to sort of the pantheon of heroes of liberty. Of course, in the eyes of white Southerners, John Brown was a terrorist, he was a murderer, and he was going to see that they were all killed in their beds if he had his way. Okay, that's John Brown. Now quickly to Abraham Lincoln, whose story is better known, but I'll contrast him with John Brown. Abraham Lincoln was as convinced as John Brown that slavery was wrong, but where John Brown believed that slavery was so wrong that it justified taking the law into his own hands, committing murder against slavery, trying to incite war, Abraham Lincoln believed that that was wrong. That was wrong itself. Those tactics were wrong. Secondly, that they were counterproductive. They were counterproductive in the short term and in the long term. Abraham Lincoln believed that slavery would end in the United States when either the Constitution was amended or the Southern states of their own volition ended slavery, just the way Massachusetts has ended slavery, and New York and Pennsylvania, all those northern states. They would come to the same conclusion out of their own self-interest eventually. Unless people like John Brown basically scared Southerners scared the daylights out of them, which is exactly what John Brown did. And so Lincoln said, in fact, when Lincoln heard of the John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry, the first thing he said is, John Brown is no Republican. John Brown is not one of us. I'm not like John Brown. Because Lincoln reasoned, quite rightly, that in the short term, John Brown's raid would actually tighten the shackles on slaves who would be denied even the very modest freedoms of just being able to see their family on another plantation that they've been exercising for a while. And in the long term, it would be counterproductive as well, because it would make Southerners believe that there was no reasoning with Northerners, especially when people like Thoreau and other Northerners said that John Brown's death was the greatest thing and John Brown was this wonderful person. It would be very much like when after 9/11 in the United States, if some groups in the United States said the attackers of 9/11, they're saints, they're heroes, we love them, we want to see more of that. And it was John Brown's raid, by no means the only thing, but it was one of the last straws that broke the back of the Union and prompted 11 southern states to secede from the Union. So Lincoln was opposed to slavery, but he was also opposed to John Brown's strategy. Lincoln believed that the freedom of all Americans depended on the Constitution, depended on the Union. Eventually, yes, the South would come around, but if the Constitution failed, then the liberties of everybody, white and black in the country, would be at risk. And furthermore, if the Constitution failed, there would be no chance of freeing the slaves. And so Abraham Lincoln was distraught at what John Brown had accomplished. And Lincoln, of course, then became president of the United States. Lincoln thought that John Brown was wrong in trying to start a war to free the slaves. And of course, John Brown's war didn't start, and he didn't free any slaves. Lincoln opposed war, but in part because of the things that John Brown set in motion, Lincoln couldn't avoid the war. When the war began, Lincoln said, this is not a war about slavery. The endless chestnut was a civil war about slavery or states' rights. For Lincoln, during the first 18 months of the war was about states' rights. It was not about slavery. He famously told Horace Greeley that he said, my job is to save the Union. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. If I could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I'd do that. If I could save the Union by freeing half and leaving half in bondage, I would do that. My job is to save the Union. But eventually, Lincoln was persuaded that saving the Union required freeing the slaves. So with the Emancipation Proclamation, all of a sudden, Abraham Lincoln finally sort of comes around to the same view as John Brown, that it's going to take force, in this case, the force of the ongoing war to free the slaves. So I'm going to stop there and let's see if we have some questions. I hope that I provoke some questions, some objections, perhaps some thoughts, and we'll take it from there. There's certainly much more to the story. So if there's some part that you think I should have said, perfectly happy to.
One thing we might start with is this whole question of moral suasion, because Concord was kind of a center of this notion of moral suasion. You talk a little bit. Did John Brown have much, appetite for those who wanted to go in that direction, and Lincoln? And then maybe we also often think about Thoreau having inspired Martin Luther King and this notion of nonviolence and changing the laws through nonviolent protest. So maybe this, which is also some part of moral suasion. Anyway, maybe talk about that as a different alternative to the violence that Brown used and that in the end Lincoln had to resort to.
Yeah. So the question my students often ask immediately is, well, wait a minute. So is John Brown a good guy or a bad guy? Should we be rooting for John Brown or not? And the way I put it is, it sort of depends on whether you think that the Civil War was necessary to end slavery. If you think the Civil War was necessary to end slavery, then John Brown simply got a head start on something that was coming anyway. And it's hard to argue with the fact that John Brown was on the right side of history. He came to the conclusion before other people that slavery was wrong and would have to be abolished by force if necessary. But if you think like Lincoln, at least Lincoln before Southern secession and before halfway through the war, that a war is not necessary, that Lincoln didn't want the Civil War to happen. Lincoln the way he put it, he was forced into the war by Southern secession. But even then, as I mentioned a moment ago, it wasn't about slavery. I mean, he knew that it was slavery that prompted Southern secession. But Lincoln avoided very clearly saying this is a war about slavery. When the Union fort at Fort Sumter in South Carolina was fired upon, when the Civil War began, Lincoln called for volunteers. He called for 75,000 volunteers. And he explicitly said that these are volunteers to save the Union. He definitely did not say, I'm asking for 75,000 volunteers to free the slaves. in part because there were at this point, there were 8 southern states, slave states, that had not seceded. Now, 4 more would secede right after Fort Sumter. But even then, there were 4 slave states that hadn't seceded. And if Lincoln declared war on slavery, Maryland immediately would be driven into the arms of the Confederacy, and Kentucky, and Missouri, and Delaware, but it's not quite so important. But those 3 big border states, they would make it a whole lot harder to save the Union. So there was that aspect of it. But Lincoln also believed that the Constitution did not give the President of the United States nor Congress the authority to rule on slavery in the states. So it couldn't be a war about slavery. So anyway, but if you think that Lincoln potentially was right, that the slavery could have been ended without a civil war, then you got to say, I think, John Brown, you're taking it too far. Because suppose we can airbrush John Brown out of history. Suppose we can take him out of Kansas, where he sort of raised the stakes but didn't do much good one way or the other, and take him out of Harper's Ferry. Suppose Southerners weren't quite so alarmed. And Lincoln was hoping, as I said, that slavery could be ended peacefully. It might have taken another decade or so. But here's something for anybody to keep in mind on this subject. In 1800, slavery was legal in just about every country in the world. And there weren't very many people who were making a fuss about it morally. There were a few groups, again, like the Quakers and the religious groups, but it was just part of life. That's 1800. In 1900, slavery was legal essentially nowhere in the world. So between 1800 and 1900, slavery disappeared. But it was only in the United States of America that this was done in the context of this huge war. Everybody else, and I'll make a partial exception for Haiti, which started early and was part of a nationalist rebellion as well. But leave that exception aside. It's only in the United States that ending slavery requires this huge war. So you got to think that maybe the war wasn't necessary to end slavery. For heaven's sakes, Brazil ended slavery without a war. So if John Brown had not lived, if John Brown had not done what he did, perhaps there would not have been a civil war, and slavery would have ended, and the 700,000 people who died in the war would not have died. I mean, at least not from the war. So, but on the other hand, if you think, and Lincoln at first thought that it was possible to end slavery without a civil war. By the end of the war, he had almost changed his mind. And so it was in part because, well, if you're the president who made decisions that in part caused this war to come, you're gonna, just from the standpoint of your emotional stability and sanity, it's really tempting to say it had to happen. It's God will, and in his second inaugural address, he famously said that it may be God's will that every drop of blood drawn by the slaver's lash must be repaid by a drop of blood drawn by the sword. So Lincoln had basically adopted John Brown's view that violence was necessary to end slavery. So my answer to the question, I mean, it's a dodge to the question. Is John Brown a hero? Should we look up to John Brown? Is he a model? I think it's crucial that Martin Luther King did not follow John Brown. If anybody, he followed Abraham Lincoln. Say, we're going to do this within the system because, well, I'm not going to say there was going to be another civil war in the 1960s, but the power of the civil rights movement in the 1960s was precisely its embrace of nonviolence. That King and other leaders of the movement, other participants in the movement, understood that at some level, the conscience of America would respond to the justice of their movement. And they were a minority. They couldn't be violently beaten into submission, so they had to be persuaded. And so we never know. We do not know. We never will know whether persuasion would have been possible in the 1860s. And that's not what happened. And so you can argue either side of it since it didn't happen. But this is sort of what you have to start with to say, well, is John Brown a model for anything?
Right. I don't want to talk about contemporary politics except this notion of insurrection and people taking law into their own hands. And I've heard you speak in the past, comparing John Brown to Timothy McVeigh or John Wilkes Booth, or the interesting example of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Just maybe speak how you talk to your students about people who think they should take the law into their own hands.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, if one had to come up with an overall philosophy of this, I would say that as long as your democracy is functioning, then violent resistance to existing law should be the very last resort. Now, when do you know you've come to the last resort? I don't have any easy answer to that. But as long as a democracy is functioning, then the only lasting reform is going to come through the ballot box, come through changes in the Constitution, come through statutes passed by state legislation, by Congress. And I will point out, by the way, that the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the United States. Lincoln understood that it wouldn't. In the first place, it exempted slaves in the border states. In the second place, it was issued on his authority as commander-in-chief, which would evaporate the moment the war ended. It was standard practice in sort of pretty much all wars for commanders of armies to seize horses and houses and mules during wartime. But the understanding was at the end of the war, you give it back. So William Sherman occupied homes that were owned by leaders of the Confederacy during the war, but that didn't make them Union property. And so if the Emancipation was the only reed that emancipation in the United States rested on, then Lincoln understood perfectly well, being a lawyer himself, that the first thing that the planters of the South would do at the end of the war was sue for the return of their property. And there was no guarantee that they wouldn't get it. So in the next breath, after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln said, okay, and we have to amend the Constitution. And so he immediately began working toward the 13th Amendment, and was crucial to Lincoln's policy, to his strategy, that at least the 13th Amendment get through Congress before the war was over. And in fact, for those of the viewers who've seen the movie Lincoln, the Steven Spielberg movie with Lincoln, that's at the dramatic heart of the movie. He's got to get this amendment passed because he knows if he doesn't get it passed before the end of the war, it might never get passed at all. And if it doesn't get passed at all, then slavery is back on the table.
So they're both martyred men. Maybe we're on the cusp, as I suggested in our introduction, on President's Day. So talk a little bit about, I know it's the counterfactual, but had Lincoln not died, would he have passed the 14th and 15th? What would his legacy be? How would he have handled Reconstruction?
The one thing I have confidence in saying about Lincoln, had he lived into Reconstruction, is that his reputation would be nowhere near what his reputation is today. Because Reconstruction was the hardest time in American history to be president. Reconstruction was pretty much going to destroy any presidency. And this because of the difference between war and peace, especially in a democracy. This is true in other forms of government, but especially in a democracy. I'll point out that slavery, and for that matter, the states' rights, these two issues, can states secede from the Union? That had been an open question from 1787 until 1865. Can slavery exist within a republic? That had been an open question, an open sore from 1787 to 1865. And the country in peacetime had not been able to resolve those issues. I'll say stop in 1861. But between 1861 and 1865, those issues were resolved once and for all. You cannot secede from the Union, and slavery will be no more. During wartime, a president can use the tools of coercion. Lincoln could and did make Southerners obey. He didn't persuade any Southerners, he simply beat them into submission. Once the war ends, those tools of coercion, they go away. The South was defeated not by Union arguments, but by Union arms. Mm-hmm. The end of the war takes the arms out of the hands of the president. He has to go back to persuasion. And as long as we're going to have a democracy, then, in that period, white people in the South outnumbered black people in the South. So even if blacks got the vote, then they weren't going to have their way. So the question for Reconstruction was, how long can the attention of the North focus sufficiently on the South to enforce good behavior on white Southerners? And the answer was, well, 4, 5, 10 years, depending on the state. But eventually, Northerners are going to say, and this would have been true whether Lincoln had been president or not, Northerners are going to say, you know what? The fate of the freedmen in the South, it's just not worth my time, the expense and all this stuff. Let Mississippi do what Mississippi is going to do. Let Virginia do what Virginia is going to do. So if Lincoln had lived into all of that, his reputation would be better than the reputation of Andrew Johnson, to be sure. It might probably be better than the reputation of Ulysses Grant, although Grant's reputation has improved over the last several decades. But it would be a lot lower than it is now. And Lincoln is generally considered to be the greatest of American presidents. And although there's still sort of a Southern, I don't say bitterness anymore, but Lincoln's not a favorite in all those Southern states, but there's a recognition that Lincoln did sort of some stuff that had to be done. But if Lincoln had been president during Reconstruction, then that's a different matter entirely, because the war's over and now he would be trying to impose Northern rule on the South during peacetime. And then this whole question, could Lincoln even have controlled his own party? The radical Republicans were going to try to claw back power that the president had grabbed away from them during the war. So yeah, it's I think interesting that two of the three greatest presidents are by consensus: Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. Well, he's right up there because he was the first. But of the non-Washington two, it's Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. And I think it's in no small part, because neither of them had to deal with the messy aftermaths of their wars. Lincoln, of course, is assassinated in 1865, and Franklin Roosevelt suffers a cerebral hemorrhage, and he dies just as the war is about to end. So he doesn't have to deal with the breakdown of the Grand Alliance and the onset of the Cold War and the McCarthyism and all this other stuff. So from the standpoint of historical reputation, it's really good to sort of go out at your best. And, it's neither one intended to do that, neither one planned to it. But from the standpoint of their historical reputations, it certainly benefited those reputations.
For those viewers who want to learn more about Franklin Roosevelt, you could do no worse than Bill's book, Traitor to This Class. It's a really wonderful volume, Franklin Roosevelt. Well, you mentioned Steven Spielberg. Let's have this be the last question, going back maybe into popular culture, but some of our viewers probably watched the show The Good Lord Bird. And for those who didn't, maybe you can answer this question first. Did you think that depiction of John Brown was accurate? And I did watch it. I mean, he's so fanatical that it still is surprising that the likes of Emerson, Thoreau, Sanborn would fall under his guise. So maybe we can end with just some words about the magnetism of John Brown. How do you capture it beautifully in your book, and maybe you can in your final words here for us this evening.
So I have to preface my remarks by saying I did not see the series, and I did not read the book, and I deliberately did not read the book or watch the series, because when I am writing a nonfiction account of an episode or series of episodes in the past, I do my best to avoid reading fictional accounts of those events, because I have a fairly sticky memory for things that I've read, but I can't always remember where I read them. And the last thing I want to do is to say, oh, boy, I remember this great story about John Brown, and write it in my book, and turns out it was made up by James McBride. So I will speak to I'll call it the broader question of, the way it's often put, was Crazy John Brown crazy? He was often called Crazy John Brown. Was he crazy? No, I don't think he was crazy. Was he a fanatic? I didn't use the term fanatic. I chose my title, Zealot, carefully. I don't know if I got it exactly right, but what I wanted to convey was the zeal with which John Brown conducted his own personal war against slavery. But not for a moment do I think that John Brown was mentally unhinged. He always could tell the difference between reality and fantasy. He did have a magnetic personality. So in terms of how he was able to persuade his abolitionist sponsors, his patrons, first of all, he was canny enough to be a man of few words when surrounded by people who were men of many, many words. he let them talk, and he let them project onto him sort of what they wanted to believe. And as I said earlier, he didn't say whether he actually committed those murders in Kansas or not, but also in contrasting what I actually in the book did call the armchair abolitionists and the way they really almost fell over themselves in support of John Brown, because he was the man of action. And these other people were men of words. And men of action often, boy, they're just catnip to men of words, because the men of words, the people of words, men and women nowadays, of words, they wish they could do that, but they don't. And the man who does, boy, he can sort of carry them away. But there was something else. John Brown understood that right was on his side, at least on the basic issue of slavery is wrong and it needs to be ended. Now, people, including Frederick Douglass, disagreed with him, Abraham Lincoln disagreed with him on the tactics, but both of them respected John Brown for his conviction. And you gotta give credit to a person who is willing to die for his cause, especially if the cause turns out to be right. It was his misjudgment. He didn't go to Harper's Ferry intending to die, but you can really see in John Brown, in the 2 weeks between the time he was captured and the time he was executed, that he came to realize that he was more valuable to the abolitionist movement dead than alive. And he embraced that new role, because at the time he was captured, he had to look on his career as an abolitionist as a failure. He had failed. He freed a dozen slaves when he took them the usual route, the Underground Railroad, but his massive uprising just didn't happen. But when he realized that, people were looking upon him as this martyr to the cause, then that was he. I think he went to the gallows in confidence that he had done something really good. So he's a model in that regard, but I tell my students and I tell anybody else, so is he a model for protest today? Well, no, please don't do that, because he's a model only if, as I alluded earlier, only if you think, and the way he would have defended his actions is, he would say the war had already started. It started in Kansas, or maybe it started in 1619 when the first slave was landed. But I don't think we're there. I certainly hope there's not a civil war in the near future. And until you conclude that that is the case, then you better not take John Brown as your model.
Bill, thank you so much. We thank the viewers for watching this evening. If I could take you out for a beer, I wish we were able to go across the street to the neighborhood pub. But again, thank you all for joining us this evening. A reminder that next Monday night on President's Day, we'll have historian Scott Casper on his book on Mount Vernon and African Americans who lived and worked in Mount Vernon, first as slaves and then after the Civil War as freedmen. So we hope you join us Monday evening at 7 o'clock. Bill Brands, thank you again so much for sharing the story of John Brown and Abraham Lincoln this evening.
My pleasure. Delighted to join you all.